In the final century of the Roman Republic, a storm of greed and ambition collided with a movement for justice, leading to one of the most dramatic conflicts in Roman history. This was the age of the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius, two courageous tribunes who took up the mantle of reform against the entrenched elite of Rome. They were driven not by personal wealth or glory, but by an unbreakable commitment to the common Roman citizen. The Gracchi saw firsthand how the vast majority of Romans were crushed under the weight of exploitative economic systems that favored the powerful few. They rose up to fight for a vision of Rome that empowered all its people. But in the end, they met a tragic fate, and in their wake rose a man named Sulla, whose brutal campaign for control set Rome on a darker path of repression, exploitation, and tyranny that would shake the Republic to its core. In the 2nd century BCE, Rome was no longer a small city-state. Its territories spanned the Mediterranean, from Spain to Greece, from North Africa to Asia Minor. This new world brought unimaginable wealth, but it also brought profound inequality. While Roman generals and senators grew wealthy from spoils of war and new lands, the backbone of Rome, its hard-working citizen farmers, was decimated. Soldiers returned home from long campaigns to find their small farms overtaken by debts or swallowed up by the ever-expanding estates of the elite. The Italian countryside transformed into vast latifundia, large estates worked by slaves and controlled by Rome's wealthiest families. The Republic's promise to its citizens had been betrayed. Ordinary Romans were left landless, impoverished, and desperate, while a like small number of elites grew fat on the spoils of empire. Enter Tiberius Gracchus, a young nobleman with a powerful sense of justice and an acute understanding of Rome's underlying crisis. In 133 BCE, he was elected as tribune of the plebs, a position meant to represent the common people. Tiberius saw that the Republic itself was at risk if the rot of inequality continued to spread. To him, it was clear that the only solution was radical reform, starting with the right of Ris River Republic, and more public relations flooded with phages. His agrarian reform bill, the Lex Sempronia Agraria, proposed taking public land illegally held by wealthy elites and redistributing it to the landless poor. This wasn't just economic reform, it was a revolutionary attack on the economic dominance of Rome's elite. However, Tiberius's reforms faced ruthless resistance from the Senate. The Roman elite saw the Gracchi brothers as nothing less than a threat to their power and way of life. To them, Tiberius's reforms were sacrilege. They threatened the very core of the economic and social order that they controlled. In a desperate bid to maintain his momentum, Tiberius bypassed the Senate altogether, bringing his reforms directly to the people. But the Senate struck back with violent force. In 133 BCE, Tiberius Gracchus was clubbed to death by a mob of senators on the Capitoline Hill. He was killed not for breaking any law, but for daring to challenge the status quo. After Tiberius's assassination, his younger brother, Gaius Gracchus, picked up the torch of reform. Gaius was even bolder and more ambitious than his brother. He sought to expand his reforms beyond land redistribution, focusing on creating a comprehensive welfare system to feed the hungry masses of Rome. In his second term as tribune, Gaius pushed through a grain subsidy that allowed poor citizens to buy grain at reduced prices, essentially creating an early form of welfare. But Gaius also went after the corrupt practices that lined the pockets of the Senate. He championed reforms to limit the power of senators over judicial matters, targeting the corruption that allowed them to manipulate courts and enrich themselves at the expense of justice. Gaius' reforms were immensely popular with the people, but they sparked the fury of the Senate. For Rome's ruling class, Gaius was more than a nuisance. He was a threat to their wealth and privileges. In 121 BCE, the Senate responded with brutal violence, declaring martial law and ordering an attack on Gaius and his supporters. In a brutal scene on the Aventine Hill, Gaius was forced to take his own life rather than be captured by his enemies. In the aftermath, thousands of his followers were executed in a bloody purge. The Republic had chosen to murder its reformers rather than reckon with its own flaws. The Gracchi were gone, but the seeds of change they had planted continued to fester. The inequality that they had tried to address only grew, and the anger of the Roman masses simmered just below the surface. Into this cauldron stepped Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a man who would take the Republic down a darker, bloodier path. Sulla was a product of the elite classes, an ambitious general who saw Rome's turmoil not as a call for reform, but as an opportunity for power. When he marched his armies into Rome in 88 BCE, it was the first time that a Roman general had turned his weapons on the city itself. It was a shocking betrayal of the Republic's ideals and a prelude to the tyranny he would impose. Under Sulla's dictatorship, the reforms of the Gracchi were not just reversed, but violently repressed. Sulla's purges swept through Rome, systematically targeting anyone who might challenge his authority. Those marked for execution were posted throughout the city, and Sulla used these lists to eliminate both enemies and rivals. Thousands of Romans were killed, their property confiscated and redistributed to Sulla's loyalists. What the Gracchi had fought for, a Rome where the common citizen had a voice, was obliterated under the iron fist of a tyrant who saw only his own interests and the interests of Rome's wealthy. Sulla's reign of terror marked the beginning of the end for the Republic. While he claimed to restore the Republic's old values, his actions laid the groundwork for its ultimate collapse. His reforms centralized power in the Senate, but the Senate he created was no longer the Senate of the Republic. It was a body dominated by his own loyalists, men who owed their positions to him and were willing to uphold the exploitation of Rome's masses to secure their own wealth. Ordinary Romans were more powerless than ever. The Gracchi's vision of economic justice was buried under the greed and brutality of Sulla's regime. In the end, Sulla's legacy was not stability but chaos. His actions inspired a generation of ambitious generals, men like Pompey, Crassus, and Julius Caesar, who would follow his example by using military power to seize control of the state. Sulla had opened Pandora's box, and the Republic would never be the same. The cycle of violence and exploitation that he set in motion would culminate in the collapse of the Republic and the rise of the Roman Empire. The people of Rome, for whom the Gracchi had sacrificed their lives, were left with only the ashes of their republic. The tragedy of the Gracchi and the tyranny of Sulla is a story of greed, courage, and the bitter cost of betrayal. It is a warning about the dangers of unchecked power and the price that ordinary people pay when leaders place their own interests above justice and equality. The Gracchi brothers dared to imagine a better Rome, a republic that served all its citizens, but in the end, they were crushed by the forces of greed and ambition that would eventually consume the Republic itself.